40 years ago this week, President Nixon declared war on drugs. So, how's that been working out for us? I'm Alan Barton. Stand by for the front page.
This is one area where we cannot have budget cuts because we must wage what I have called total war against public enemy number one in the United States, the problem of dangerous drugs.
All right, that was Richard Nixon, 1972, joining me here in 2011 in PJTV's Los Angeles studios to discuss the results of the war on drugs. Don Watkins, analyst at the Ayn Rand Center for Individual Rights, and James Poulos, a journalist, commentator, and host of The Bottom Line on PJTV. All right, gentlemen, I think over the last 40 years we've spent, what, $1 trillion, something along that, on the drug war. The death rate from drug overdoses has quadrupled in that time. Sounds like a pretty good federal program, $1 trillion and no change. So is the war a failure? Or would the problem be worse if we had made less effort than we already have? What do you think?
Well, let's face it, this is not total war, right? If you want to declare total war on drugs, you go the Singapore route. You get the canes out, throw people in jail for the rest of their lives, string them up. This is not a real war. This is something that costs as much as a war, but achieves less than a war. Nobody really, really wants a total war on drugs, so we're stuck with this bizarre middle policy that doesn't seem to be working and isn't really doing anyone any favors.
That's interesting. I mean, he says, look, there are countries where everyone knows, like, do not take drugs to this country. They will string you up. They will throw you in jail. So there are deterrents that are effective because they scare the out of you. And it seems that we are not doing that. So what do you say on this?
I mean, the fundamental question is not, can we succeed? The fundamental question is this a proper purpose of government? And I say that the basic principle of America is that people can engage in voluntary decisions and that the government does not have a right to interfere with that, even in cases where those decisions can be profoundly immoral. Now, if you engage in actions that are violent, which are associated with drug use, then punish the violence and punish the force. Punish you interfering with the freedom of other people. But the idea that we're going to throw somebody in jail for smoking marijuana, it's ridiculous. As Yaron Brook, who sits in for this, usually likes to say, you can't really win a war against an inanimate object.
All right, Eric Sterling, the attorney at the House of Representatives, principally responsible for apparently overseeing the Drug Enforcement Agency. He's followed the drug on wars. Wow, that's where we are, ladies and gentlemen. The war on drugs since its inception, and he says this: most school-based prevention efforts, such as DARE, have been proven to be ineffective. Yet hundreds of millions of dollars are spent on such efforts, and drug use has continued to grow. 2009, there were 21.8 million users of illicit drugs, several of them in the control room of this studio. Couldn't resist. So given the money that we've spent, why don't we look at the efficacy here? Why hasn't it been more successful? This is a tremendous amount of money and technology and resources applied. Seems to be doing nothing.
More people want to do drugs. We can spend all this money to try to convince people not to do drugs. They want to do them anyway. The drugs are getting a little more powerful, yes, but I think we got to look at why is there this deep desire to do marijuana and other drugs. Maybe there are some acceptable answers to that question, answers we can live with. Maybe there are some that aren't very acceptable, but I think that's where we are, just bigger demand.
Ex-President Jimmy Carter now endorses proposals to switch from a war on drugs to a legal regulation. Yet the Netherlands, everyone uses this as the example. They've attempted legal regulation of marijuana since 1984. Pot use there has tripled. So legalizing drugs, shouldn't we try to stigmatize its use? Is there any function for the government as an entity to try to stigmatize certain bad behaviors? I'll go with you. I
mean, if you think that it's bad, then you have the perfectly freedom to go out there and tell people, this is bad and I'm not going to deal with you if you do it. The bigger problem today is why is it so widespread in its use? And I'd say that is the corruption of the culture. But a culture always becomes more corrupt the less freedom that you have. And so I would definitely think if you maintained all our same policies today and legalized drugs, it would have some pretty ugly consequences. In a better culture like this used to be, before drugs were made illegal, fewer people use them, not because they didn't know they existed, but because you had a happier, more successful, more rational culture. And that is really the issue that we should be advocating for, not just this negative of don't ruin your brain.
Well, but let's be clear, though. You don't really get to choose whether or not to deal with someone who's on heroin or who's stumbling around in public knocked out on hallucinogens. I mean, not all drugs are created equal, and the experience that your experience as someone who's not on drugs, running into people who are in public, it's not something you have complete control over. So there are nuances here.
I mean, a lot of states are moving towards decriminalizing marijuana, California being one of them, and part of that is, I don't think, a moral standing on drug use or not drug use, but they can't afford the prison and the courts and the court costs, and California is having to empty their prisons from overcrowding, and so they're saying, look, here's a nonviolent criminal act that doesn't seem to do much. Do you see that as driving the move to decriminalization, is just the cost of it, or do you think people are actually rethinking the moral stand on the legalization of drugs?
There seems to be a little bit of both. I mean, the fact of the matter is, when you see your kid or your cousin go to jail and lose his chance at college, be hobbled in success in life for doing something that you probably did once or twice while you were in school, people see that there's something really wrong about this. And I think that is definitely happening. But part of it, I just think, is we have a more subjective culture that doesn't have very high standards.
All right, presidential candidate Gary Johnson of Arizona takes this position on the drug issue. Why don't we fire up the drums, please, and take a listen.
When it comes to drugs, first thing I want to say with regard to drugs is don't do drugs. Don't drink either. I haven't had a drink in 22 years. Best decision I ever made. That said, I would ask you all to look at this issue. Just look at the issue. Get online. See if you don't come to the same conclusion that I have, and that is that 90% of the drug problem is prohibition-related, not use-related, and that is not to discount the problems with use, but that ought to be our focus. This is a health issue, not a criminal justice issue.
By the way, I misspoke there. He's not from Arizona. It's New Mexico. That's where Governor Johnson is from, New Mexico. That was not drug-related. That was tequila-related. That's what's in this coffee cup. A little tequila. It's Friday afternoon. All right, so other than doing his Steve Jobs impression there, what are you wearing, Governor? Why are you dressed like Steve Jobs? I thought he was going to release OS Lion, OS Panther, OS... What are they going to do when they run out of those, by the way? Okay, what would a proper policy look like? What do you think?
Well, you can tell a tequila joke on television. No one gets upset, right? So what you have to do here is you have to find a way to get to regular middle American folks, make a case for them, I think, that says, look, let's just start with marijuana. Present it to them in a way that they will accept. One way that they won't accept it is if a guy, with all due respect to Governor Johnson, gets up and says, I haven't had a drink in 22 years, and we should legalize marijuana. That's strike one and strike two for most Americans. Got to go about it a different way.
Why? Because you see it as a hypocrisy there, or are you like, well, I got to, but you don't?
It's out of step with the mainstream. What regular Americans don't want is someone to say, hey, smoking pot is great, it's a lot of fun, I recommend it. And they also don't want someone saying, look, we should legalize drugs because we can really count on everyone to just, through the process of changing the culture and education, we can count on everyone to abandon the use of all drugs entirely, including cigarettes and alcohol. These things are bad for our health, so we'll just go with like a culture of public health. I think both of those things are going to strike most people as alien.
All right, or you could just dress like Steve Jobs, since anything that Steve Jobs says, people are like, I want that. Whatever he's selling, I want that. So maybe that was his point. All right, gentlemen, viewers, join in on the discussion. Would you decriminalize drugs to lead to a more, wow, it's the tequila. Would decriminalizing drugs lead to more drug use or less? Click the comment button below to join the discussion. These are simple sentences, people. Just say them. For Don Watkins and James Poulos, I'm Alan Barton. You've been watching Front Page.